Okay, good morning. Thank you so much, Bayes, and also to Professor Salmons for inviting me here today. It's a bit intimidating to be asked to do a keynote speech, so I hope you take whatever I say, at least as a note for reflection. I also like the attitude that please feel free to challenge me. I'm going to say quite a lot about topics that are not settled or terms that are not settled. So this is very often a start of a conversation. Really try to challenge me. I understand I have a little more time than I thought, so I'll see how far I get after 20 minutes. I know that you will have opportunity to talk throughout this morning as well, so let's see how much I can do. So thank you so much for inviting me to this inauguration of the University College London Internal Displacement Monitoring Center Disaster Displacement Research Hub. My name is Atle Solberg, and I'm head of the Secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, PDD, that was established in 2016 by the government of Germany and Bangladesh. And we are based in Geneva, the Secretariat, but we are also part of a large network, a steering group of 17 member states, and also with the strong participation of the High Commissioner for Refugee, International Organization for Migration, and also a key partner is Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. The aim of the PDD is to follow up on the Nansen Initiative and to support the recommendation of the Nansen Initiative agenda for the protection of cross-border displaced persons in the context of disaster and climate change, the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. And if you haven't seen it before, this is how it looks like, the protection agenda, and I recommend you also to look it up. The objective of the Nansen Initiative, based on a pledge by Norway and Switzerland at the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugee, Ministerial Conference in December 2011, was to build consensus on key elements and principles to better protect people displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change. Importantly, and in order to get to that objective of creating consensus, the Nansen Initiative launched a research program and convened a series of regional intergovernmental consultation and civil society meetings between 2012 and 2015. The consultative process with states culminated with endorsement of the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda at an intergovernmental global consultation in October 2015 in Geneva, Switzerland, supported by 110 states. So this document has the endorsement of 110 states. Often, when I present the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda and the work of the Nansen Initiative, I often underline the priority we gave in our work from 2012 to 2015, in particular two aspects. One is, how do we frame the issue of displacement? How can we have tools, conceptual tools, and conceptual framework that can enhance understanding of human mobility dynamics and patterns in the context of disaster and adverse effects of climate change? So key priority for us at the outset was that framing exercise, and that's a word I will come back to. I think we still have work to do in the way we understand and how we frame these issues. We have already started to use a set of terms that have different meanings for different peoples. The second area of work is how do we generate consensus among states? And how can we identify existing practices and assess the relevance and applicability of policy instruments and norms related to averting, minimizing, or addressing disaster displacement and protecting disaster displaced persons? Essentially, what are effective policy tools and how can we build normative and policy framework that better protects people? I think the point I wanted to make with this is that for both of these areas of work, this is extremely important, the way we could draw on and use researchers, academics, and the expertise of experts. Without that knowledge and expertise, we would not have reached such a broad consensus on the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. So when I was asked to come here today, and say a few words at the occasion of the launching or inauguration of the University College London and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center Disaster Displacement Research Hub. I wanted in particular to underline the relevance of the research program we launched under the Nansen Initiative and the importance of research for the work of the PDD and how important researchers and academic communities and experts are for our work. So that's why we are really excited to be with you today. So I can only congratulate UCL and IDMC for this initiative. We are very excited to be able to support and draw on your work. We are also excited that IDMC is part of this initiative. IDMC is a key partner to our work. It has been a key partner under the Nansen Nansen Initiative. As part of our governance structure, in addition to states, we have an advisory committee of more than 100 experts and practitioners. And IDMC, they co-chair what we refer to as a data and knowledge working group under our advisory committee. And I hope that the PDD can also benefit and draw on the work of the research hub that is inaugurated today, and that we can find a way to work together. I also wanted to say a few words about research and policy development. A lot of our work is situated at the intersection of research, evidence and analysis on one side, and policy development on the other. How we frame and understand social and political issues are central for the policy debate or the policy work that we engage in. And although I think we have come a long way the last 10 years or the last 10, 15, 20 years in terms of better evidence, data, and knowledge in this field, and much of this thanks to the work of partners like IDMC, University College London, and others, I still think there is a lot of work to do. There are arguably all types of gaps in our understanding of human displacement or disaster displacement, if you like, in the context of extreme weather events and climate change, the topic of this summit. And we shall not relax, and we shall not consider that our knowledge in approaching these issues is sufficient at the current stage. I don't think that we have gaps in our knowledge and understanding should come as no surprise. Displacement, or the fact that people are forced or are faced or obliged to flee, refer to a range of situations and circumstances. We refer to individual flights. It can be ordered evacuation. Movement can be short-term and short distance. It can be longer-term and over longer distances. Movement can be temporary. Movement can be permanent. We can have movement internally and across borders. It's clearly that different tools, metrics, methodologies are needed in order to capture the diversity of movement or displacement in the context of disasters and adverse effect of climate change. It's also important for our work that protection needs of people compelled to move is not always a given. It's not clear that displacement in itself creates a specific protection need. Displacement can also be life-saving, as we know. And if you have robust public policies and safeguards and preparatory work, the mobility outcome may not need or may not represent a protection gap. We are also faced in this complexity of understanding by the task of often having to unpack and distinguish between movement that is more anticipatory or voluntary, migration if you like, from those movements that are more reactionary and more forced displacement, if you like. That distinction might be important because different protection and policy framework may be applicable depending on the characteristics of the movement. I think Baez already alluded to this, that if you find yourself in a situation of having international protection because you meet the criteria of being a refugee, there are tools and policies in place for you. If you fall outside that protection framework, you may not have the same entitlement to protection. So that's a gap we are working on. We also have challenges from a data and evidence point of view, because we know that motivations and reason for individual moving are always very diverse. Beyond individual circumstances of an individual moving, we know that disaster displacement is multi-causal and the result of a range of driver and hazards and with different human mobility outcomes, even immobility. In many situations, we may or should even be more concerned about those that are unable to move out of harm's way than those that are able to move out, for example, with the support of evacuation and in a life-saving situation. The multi-causality of any human movement in the context of disaster and adverse of climate change also makes it difficult to distinguish between what is climate-related from what is related to other types of natural hazards, or even events of more political, social, and demographic character. So the issue we are talking about is not necessarily easy to pinpoint in the real empirical world. We talk about movement in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change, but what exactly are we referring to when we use those terms? We also know that from a risk understanding point of view, overly focus on the hazards, i.e. a natural hazard, an earthquake, or the adverse effect of climate change, may lead us to miss out on important aspects of the vulnerability and exposure these individuals are facing. We need to have a broader understanding of both the hazards as well as the vulnerability, the exposure, and the capacity to use a risk language, which I'm sure people here today are far more prepared to talk about than I am. But we should not underestimate that climate change is evidently dramatically changing the risk landscape and increasingly shaping the pattern and dynamics of human mobility. So that's a new factor. It's not new. I'm sorry to say it's not new, but it's a growing factor that we need to scale up both the side of understanding, but also our policy response to these challenges. And regardless of how we frame and conceptualize moving in the context of disaster and climate change, and how we understand the nexus or the nexuses between situations, drivers, and outcomes, we have also learned from our work that policies and norms are lagging behind. Again, back to the point, if you find yourself in a situation meeting the criteria of the Refugee Convention, you may have access to international protection. If you do find yourself in a situation compelled to move to another country, there's very little in international law. There's very little guidance, and there's very little understanding in terms of obligation one country has to admit and let people stay from another countries. So even with something like the protection agenda, the policy development and the normative development side of things are lagging behind. And it's an extremely important role of researchers and academics to feed those gaps and that analysis to policy maker. We need to know much more and strengthen our understanding of what will be relevant and applicable policy instrument that can effectively avert, minimize, and address displacement. Because it's not clear what is the best policy response in a given situation. What role has climate change policy to play? What role has disaster risk reduction to play? What role has sustainable development? What role has migration policies to play? It's clearly that these need to come together, but we are still lagging behind in our understanding on how they can be implemented in an integrated and holistic manner. I wanted to conclude by highlighting that I think there are particularly two areas of work where I see the research hub can help driving this issue further. And we would be very happy to join you on that journey and work together. One is basic work around generating evidence and address data gaps that can help us understand, frame, and conceptualize the issue. I have a list of all the types of data gaps that we are encountering in this area. Data gaps are related to the conceptual side of things. How do we understand? How do we turn the phenomenon at that we are facing? Data gaps are related to technical shortcomings. What type of tools are available? How do we work with metrics and IT software? It's also an operational challenge. How do we access data knowledge from people having faced these natural hazards and circumstances? And there's also an institutional gap, as you so very often refer to. And it's related to who collects data, who is responsible to collect data, how do you ensure what data experts call interoperability, how do we make data sources coming together. So there are all types of data gaps, which I also will encourage the Research Hub to work on and seeking to address. Framing and understanding these issues are critical for then further policy development. And the second area of work where I think we need your help is how do we understand the role and the relevance and applicability of different policies and policy frameworks? What is exactly the role of different policies when it comes to disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and human mobility framework? It's still not clear what would work best in a given circumstances. There are talks about new global obligation in this area. Would that be a good idea? Is it more useful to work along regional frameworks and policy instruments? Or what do we need at national level? There is still a gap in terms of understanding the applicability and scope of relevant policies in these areas. Concluding, I can only congratulate the organizer for a timely and relevant and important initiative. We know that we have seen from some papers that have been circulated before this summit that the World Bank, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, everyone has generated more and better data, evidence, and understanding. So we are on a good track, but there is more to do. And I also will make the plea for that support in order to drive the policy development agenda. We are still very much in the dark in terms of the effectiveness on policies. I want to give you a very quick example. The Global Compact for Migration was adopted by member states in December 2018. It has very specific provision in its Objective 2 about how to address driver and manage risks related to climate change, disaster, and environmental degradation. In this Objective 2, it speaks directly to pathways in circumstances of disaster, environmental degradation, and climate change. We did a baseline mapping of policy development in this area, and it's clear that we are only starting to develop those policies, and we are still trying to understand what would be effective or good practices at national level. So I also make a plea to that two-folded or two-sided approach around framing, understanding, and theoretical development, coupled with support to further understanding of what policies can be applicable. And I think you have gotten it right when you talk about you want to be an international hub, you want to be interdisciplinary, you want to look at the complex nexus, climate change, disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and human mobility. I think that captures all the keywords. And also the recognition that policy responses and sound public policy require actionable evidence and sound understanding of the social phenomenon that is to be addressed. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to be challenged, and I also look forward to continue discussing a topic that is manifestly complex and evolving and difficult to get our heads around sometimes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atle.
I have taken notes. Probably I myself have 10 questions, but I don't want to ask it now. So yeah, from the audience, please, if you have any question, please raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bias, Atle, and Peter, for some excellent opening remarks. I'm Salimul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University, Bangladesh. I just arrived late last night from Bonn, where we have been talking about particularly loss and damage, and in the context of loss and damage, people losing their livelihoods and being displaced. I would ask you what your thoughts are on that. I'll be speaking in a panel later, so I'll share my thoughts at that point. But right now, how do you see the work that has already been done in this arena for some time now, linking up with the climate regime, because that is now the key. The climate regime is only now, beginning to link up with this issue of forced displacement. And a lot of questions remain, but the opportunities for taking that forward, I think, are significant based on the work that is already being done. My question is, what are your thoughts on how you make that happen? Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you, Salim, and I feel a bit intimidated to answer a question you are posing, given your expertise. And I think I have to be, I work for states. We have a steering group. There are, on one side of the room, states that have one point of view on loss and damage, and on the other side of the room, there are other views. So I need to be a little timid in this. But I do think that we have achieved quite a lot if we do put a 10-year span on it. Let's do an assessment from 2013, when the Warsaw International Mechanism was established. Then we go to Paris, 2015. There is then creation of the so-called Task Force on Displacement that came out with recommendations on how to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to adverse effect of climate change. I think with good reason, yourself or all of us can be a bit disappointed in terms of progress being made after the Madrid decision in 2018 on establishing a Santiago network on loss and damage. But I do also see that the policy discussion is getting denser, and there is stronger recognition of that link between loss and damage and displacement. So we see it as a huge opportunity to fill that space with knowledge and evidence I've been talking about, but also in terms of what type of policy response would be useful. I think the situation of Bangladesh is so dramatically different from a country like Fiji or a country like Guatemala or Kenya, so it needs to be very much tailored. So in that sense, maybe glass half full rather than half empty. I think we need to seize the moment now, seize the discussion on the more institutional arrangement on the Santiago network for loss and damage. You know much better than I do, the financing side is a very thorny issue. What we are trying to do, and I'm very happy that ICAD are joining us, that why can't we also try to focus on specific project and action on the ground that can help countries avert, minimize, and address displacement. So meanwhile, we are waiting for that climate regime to clock in or dock in. We need to continue working on this. And I think, again, evidence is important. What I sense, and maybe I would like to turn this back to you because I couldn't go to Bonn, is that there is much more discussion on the impact side of loss and damage. And I think there we have a job to also illustrate and provide that evidence. I think that is a territory where we would see a specific added value being displacement focus, and that's the impact side. So maybe you can give me a little sense how the discussion has shifted. So you, thank you.
If you're staying on beyond 11, I'll speak about it in the next panel.
Okay, thank you, Atle. So one last question from you from my end, and then we go for 10 minutes short break, and we get back at 11 for the panel one. So you talked about two gaps. One is about data and evidence, and the other one is policy and frameworking. But interesting, I was thinking, we have someone, Professor Hawk, who has attended all the 26 COP meetings, and on the other hand, we have Professor Ilan Kelman here, who had a very interesting webinar or workshop last month, and they said, do we need another COP? Do we need COP 27? So my question is to you. I mean, whenever we go, people say, okay, you bring a nice model, World Bank did, two back-to-back reports, bounce well. And I heard from many scientists, this is the crap, okay? These projections, they have flaws, technical flaws, methodological flaws, definitions, I talked about it. And we are having COP 27, 8, 10, I don't know, 100, and others are criticizing, do we need another IPCC report? It's the same report they're publishing every year. But my question is, where should we stop in collecting data and evidence and talking to the same person again and again? Dr. Mollik was talking yesterday. If you go to the coastal communities and start with asking questions, you don't need to really ask them questions because they have been interviewed already probably 50 times, the same person, and the person will be just saying, okay, I know the question, my monthly income is this, you don't need to ask, my age is this, my gender is this, yes, I face cyclone twice in a year. So my question is, where should we scientists stop in terms of collecting data and evidence, going round and round like COP 27, 30, COP 100, and challenging each other? And where do we get the policy framework? Ultimately, we need to talk about the victim. I say none of us here, and within the probably 1,000 kilometers radius, none of us are the victims. I mean, actually, we are talking about people suffering in this kind of context. Someone is living probably inside that house from coastal, southern coast. So my question is, where should we stop in blaming on data gaps, models, technical shortcomings, softwares you mentioned, institutional data, who is responsible to collect data, and actually how we go and achieve the ultimate policy in protecting those people who have been displaced by disasters. So that's the last question, and we go for a 10 minutes short break. Thank you.
I was far too ambitious when I prepared my talking points this morning or yesterday, so I have some elements I didn't talk much about, but I think we constantly need to get a better understanding of this, because what I heard lately, tipping point, okay, what is the meaning of a climate system tipping point? I'm from Norway, so I have a layman understanding, so if the Gulf Stream suddenly stops, it's gonna get quite colder in my country. But that's a climate system tipping point. And then we have to understand, will that have implication for mobility? Probably fishermen, agriculture production on the West Coast. So that's an area where we need to start unpacking much more. So tipping point is, for me, we need more understanding on how that manifests itself on the ground and the impact on people. We haven't really done that exercise, linking tipping point with, for example, mobility outcomes. So you need to research that. What about a new thing we heard much more frequently? Sally, maybe you will say more about hard adaptation limits. So what is that in terms of trying to understand if, as an individual facing hard adaptation limits, i.e. probably adaptation or risk reduction won't be that effective anymore, or maybe it's not even effective. What does that mean? That means moving out or trying to stay. We know that trying to stay for too long may lead to maladaptation. For example, we heard from Vanuatu, this insistence of rebuilding coral reefs have led to huge investment in protecting the coral reefs, but they are wiped out by frequent tropical cyclones. So the investment is gone, and people may find themselves in a situation of maladaptation because they have reached a hard adaptation limits. But I'm not going to be the one to define those situations. That is an extremely complex situation to unpack and understand, and I think that's something we need to research and work on. Loss and damage. Maybe Salim, you will talk more about what is loss and damage. It's already starting to, in Bonn, understand, can we separate losses from damages? What are loss and damage when we talk about avert, minimize, and address? What are the different aspects? To me, it's quite clear that avert and minimize sit squarely under the Framework Convention because it's all about mitigation and adaptation and resilience. But when we move into the address side, it's clearly that there are more outside of the convention that is needed, and we need to better understand this concept. Inhabitability is another concept that we are frequently being used, and that again shows the importance of more research, more data. And finally, just to maybe answer, I think this is where the glass is half empty for me in terms of more data and knowledge, because I think we need different knowledge and different data for different purposes. When you need to do your disaster risk reduction efforts or policies, that requires a different set of data than what you need if you want to respond to an tropical cyclone or a displacement or evacuation. So there are all types of different data needs out there and different knowledge. I'm not sure whether that is an excuse for no further policy development, but I find it hard to have a meaningful discussion about tipping points, for example, without a much clearer understanding what does that mean and how is that linked to, for example, human mobility outcomes. So that's my maybe a little call for more data and knowledge. We are really behind the curve in our understanding of this phenomenon.
Okay, thank you, Atle. Thank